Alanis Morissette needs no introduction. We've lived her music, we lived her emotions, we lived her life. We have the amazing opportunity to talk with her today about forgiveness. But most importantly, I want to say that what I am so grateful for is Alanis's gift as a friend, as a wife, as a mother, as a co-journeyer exploring life together. And I just want to thank you for your time, Alanis, and for this opportunity to talk about forgiveness, for joining us on the Tutu Global Forgiveness Challenge. Alanis is taking the challenge with us. I just want to start off talking about the relationship between your music and your own forgiveness journey. It seems like the lyrics that you sing in You Ought to Know and the lyrics you sing in This Grudge obviously expresses a real transformation in your own relationships and in your own life. And I just wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's been a long journey of finding ways to creatively channel my own personal reactivity and my own anger and take responsibility for it, because I've just found how empowering it is for me to take responsibility for my reactions and my responses to what life has tossed or hurtled my way, either way. And I think part of the songwriting process, the invitation in art for me is this gorgeous catharsis that can happen. And I naively thought that the writing of a song could provide healing. But I really quickly came to see that regardless of how many nights I would sing You Ought to Know over and over again on stage, that the real healing came from actual relationships and communication and my taking responsibility for my side of the street. And so over the years, I would muster up the courage that was so easy for me to apply to songwriting and attempt to apply that to my relationships. And that's when healing really did start to happen.
Well, I remember you I remember you saying that creativity is not necessarily catharsis. And I thought that was a very powerful statement. And it's kind of what you were saying now, that the healing has to happen in a different way. It has to happen in a relationship. And maybe you could talk a little bit more about what is so healing about our relationships and what difference that makes.
Well, it's being scientifically corroborated. It's being, the mirror neurons, the fact that we need each other, and that's really evidenced in the attachment stage of our own development as babies and onward, that when we have that eye contact, that skin on skin, that commitment and intimacy, which is commensurate to the degree of healing that is available, it really shows us that our relationships, particularly the ones that we commit to long term, really hold out the invitation for great healing mutually, because we can correct any interactions, neglectful ones, abusive ones from our past, that it's never too late and that love can heal it all if we're intentional around it and we know what we're up to, that we can be active participants in each other's healing. So when it's a really committed friendship or community or marriage or even business partnership, frankly, when we sign up for the proverbial long haul, we're committing to really great junctures and opportunities for healing that I didn't know was possible until I started committing, and now I've become a commitment junkie, a healing junkie. I can't create and participate in, and frankly receive enough opportunities to correct anything that we may have missed in our childhoods and onward.
Well, let's jump back for a second to You Ought to Know. I mean, kind of what was your relationship to at that point to this process of healing and forgiveness? I mean, obviously that's, kind of the breakup anthem for many people. There's a lot of raw and beautiful emotion in that song, but it's certainly, it's very much it's not from a place of forgiveness, obviously, at that point.
The opposite. I also think that the road to forgiveness is exactly that. It's a path toward forgiveness. Yeah. And on an egoic human psyche level, attempting to forgive before the natural process has unfolded is almost like putting the cart before the horse in a really almost violent way. So sometimes the forgiveness process for me happens in 10 seconds. And sometimes, unfortunately and embarrassingly, perhaps, it would take 10 years. And so what I found was that when I tried to rush the process toward forgiveness on an intellectual level, it didn't allow for the natural unfolding toward understanding of what was going on, because if I was attempting to forgive someone from an egoic state, I don't think my ego has the capacity to even understand what forgiveness is. It implies that someone has, quote unquote, done me wrong, which on an egoic level may be accurate. On a spiritual level, there is nothing to forgive. You know, we're all bumping into each other, we're stepping on each other's toes, we're offending each other, we're potentially healing each other, we're helping each other out, we're ignoring each other. I mean, we're on a human level, we're basically go-karts bumping into each other a lot. On a spiritual level, we're inextricably linked, we're connected, we're all these individuated spirits in human form. And so to the degree that we forget that we're connected, we can offend each other and really maim and hurt each other, frankly. So in that sense, it's appropriate to have forgiveness. When I come at things from a more spiritual place, when I can access that, and I certainly can't all the time, forgiveness is such a given that the term almost is inappropriate, because it's really understanding. You know, once I understand the big picture of what the interaction was, that it's alchemically attempting to bring me to my next stage of evolution, and it's the invitation for both parties or all parties involved to evolve our souls, then context is like a mechanism or a catapult into our next stage of evolution. It's really exciting, you know. But if my very small s self is asked to forgive prematurely, it's a disaster. And that's when when I take my quote-unquote inability to forgive at any given moment and I put it into a song, it can really kickstart the movement from that despair to a more activated anger, appropriately expressed. You know, I think art is a great context to express emotion, certainly anger, in a way that's safe and not destructive. Yeah. And then move on to the greater understanding and the natural organic forgiveness arrival point that I think is where we arrive when we do get the big picture of what's going on a macrocosmic level in terms of how our souls operate. So songwriting to me is telling the story, which is a very egoic experience, and it's really fun, and it's colorful, and it's dramatic, and it's conflict-filled, because ego can't help itself. You know, and then when I allow myself to step back and disidentify from the story and disidentify from our small sort of identities, I really can see that we're inextricably linked, that we're connected on a soul level, and that there really is nothing to forgive, and if anything, there's something to be grateful for. Now, that's when I'm in my highest place, which I'm obviously not in all the time. So when I'm in that sort of, I'll call it my smaller place, that's the best time for me to write art. There's no bad time to write art. You know, when I'm in a particularly spiritual, awake place, fantastic time to write a song. When I'm in a very small, revenge-filled, you know, egoic place, it's a lovely time to write a song. You can't really go wrong. But it has been a journey for me, and I'm aware of where I'm at in terms of my smaller S self or my big S self, dependent upon how willing I am to quote unquote forgive somebody. You know, if I'm, you know, that was my next question, which is, how do you personally know in your life what tells you that you're ready to forgive somebody? When do you know that you're ready for that step of the journey? Often forgiveness and understanding are bedfellows for me. They're commensurate. So when I really get a clear sense of what was going on, and I've extracted as many lessons and awarenesses and revelations as I possibly can, and I've also taken responsibility for where I was sleepwalking and what was my responsibility, what I chose to do, my 50%. Forgiveness is something that happens through me. It's not something that I have to will into happening. So I know that when I'm trying to will forgiveness into being, that I'm not ready yet, that it's a little too early.
Right. I mean, in the Forgiveness Challenge, we ask people to find somebody that they are ready to forgive. And to walk that fourfold path of telling the story and naming the hurt and granting forgiveness, which is very much what you said about Beautiful. Discovering that shared humanity and coming to that understanding, and then deciding whether one wants to renew or release the relationship.
Right, and then that you can forgive, but also keep the boundary and not agree with the circumstance or not agree with the behavior. Right. That you can separate the behavior from the human soul, the human/soul. You know, and that when someone behaves in a way that's offensive or abominable or however we want to label it. There's still a soul in there. You know, whether we can appeal to that soul or not is a whole other conversation, but to realize that there's a soul in there is to be ready to forgive on some level. So it depends on how awake I am. When I'm sleepwalking, forgiveness is a tough one.
Well, it's for everyone. And I mean, I think, the hope of the forgiveness challenge, I think the hope of the tutus is to call people to awaken in that way. And I mean, I think, one of the things that you talk about in, this such a resonant line for so many of us is the mess you left when you went away. And, so many people have left messes in our lives, or we've left messes in other people's lives. And there's just a lot of mess making. And so I guess, one of the questions would be, yes, as you said at the beginning of the interview, when we're committed to being in that relationship and healing that relationship, then it is an incredibly beautiful process often to go through that process of understanding and healing together. But sometimes, people just left a mess and we, are not interested in cleaning it up, or they're not committed to it, or we're not in relationship with that person. And sometimes we can get back in relationship and renew a relationship. But I guess I'm wondering, in your experience and in your life, if you have any examples of, or can share with us what it's like when you have to do that work on your own and you can't necessarily do it with somebody else.
Yeah, I probably have more experiences of doing the forgiveness work on my own than I do, unfortunately, have had the experience of doing it directly with people. I'm at a place now where the kinds of connections that I have become more and more functional, to the point where even forgiving each other is something that we don't often really need to do, because we catch ourselves pretty quickly to the point where we don't wildly offend each other. In our best moments. I have to follow what I say, but in our best moments. But the experiences where I've forgiven someone long distance, I'll call it, where I'm not actually sitting across from them, I really do my best to ritualize it and turn it into a meditation where I'm just connecting purely with their souls. And it's a soul connection. And I find that, like I said earlier, if I'm connecting on a spiritual level, the term forgiveness is actually not even appropriate to name the level of connection and understanding and kismetness that I feel on a soul level. It's more on the egoic level it's almost like giving someone the green light to maybe not continue to beat themselves up. Like if I say to someone, of course I forgive you, it's really giving them the green light to stop beating themselves up for having hurt or offended or abandoned or neglected me in that particular case. But I never really expect it. I never really even actually expect anyone to ask for forgiveness. But I do realize that there's a warmth and a prayer and a love that is made available through the act of that forgiveness or that connection or that understanding. So I'll often do it when I don't have the luxury on a personality level of having a real exchange with someone. I'll do it on a soul level, and I'll meditate, and I'll just connect soul to soul, and I'll get a lot of lessons in those rituals, and I'll really get what was going on. And often, if not every single time, it was that human being, whether they were aware of it or not, they were participating in my awakening, me coming out of my slumber.
Interesting. Yeah, it's beautiful, that participation in our awakening is kind of a gift. That doesn't always feel like a gift. But, the tutus talk about it in the book of Forgiving, how forgiveness is actually a gift, but it's not just a gift that we give to others, it's a gift we give to ourselves. And I guess I wonder if you could talk about, from your experience, what role that gift has played in your life. What has it freed you from? What difference has forgiveness made for you?
Yeah, great question. It really has pulled me out of victim consciousness. There's such a collapse and a buckling that comes from feeling, quote unquote, wronged by other and being in that blameful state. It's not an empowered place. It's not a connective place. It's a very separatist concept to stay in that victim blameful place. So there's an empowerment that comes from letting that go, because ultimately forgiveness to me is realizing our spiritual connection and letting go of the victim consciousness stance. So everybody wins in that one. Our connection is celebrated and marked through the forgiveness. And my disempowerment, I'm absolved of my disempowerment, and I can actually move forward feeling responsible, not responsible for other people, but responsible for my participation or my corroboration or my continuation of a dynamic. So there's an awakening, there's an empowerment, and there's a connection. There's only a payoff in the forgiveness process.
That's beautifully said. I mean, the role of victim that we all step into from time to time. I'd be interested to hear kind of when you're in the small s self rather than the big S self.
Yeah, those two. Can't they get along?
Because I spend a lot of time there too. And, what is happening in that victim space, besides the sense of separation and isolation, but, what causes us to rant and, kind of raise our fist and, and raise ourselves in fury at that other person, and in some cases want revenge. That's often where it can lead for people. Either revenge that can be punishing of the other person, or ultimately can be punishing of ourselves. So
everybody loses, in the revenge process when it's acted out. I think the idea of going from despair and despondency in a linear way through anger and into even just thoughts of revenge is actually a powerful process to move through as we move toward clarity, absolution, mutual responsibility taking ideally, but even not taking our 50%, and all of the beautiful payoffs from forgiveness. It's almost like there are rites of passage in a linear way, moving through them to get to forgiveness. So for me, it's about honoring and marking every wave of emotion that passes through us, as whether they're the stages of grief or whether they're the stages of moving toward greater peace and surrender around the whole concept, but to deny ourselves the very human linear process of moving from despair and despondency through rage or anger, or through even thoughts of revenge. The acting out of revenge, nobody wins there. That's just destruction. But the contemplation of it, or the murderous rage and the revengeful thoughts, I think entertaining them, and this is where art comes in too, draw it, paint it, write about it, journal about it, process it with a safe friend in a safe context, or a therapist. I think it's perfectly appropriate, because ideally we want to go from the disempowered, hopeless, helpless, lonely place that is felt when there's a conflictual, disruptive, separatist circumstance that happens that even requires forgiveness. It's a natural stage to move through these very human emotions to get to a place where we can forgive. So when I'm supporting my own self or my friends in moving through it, I really actually sometimes lead them toward sharing with me what they're specifically angry about, what they're specifically wishing they could do in this revenge, because there's a lot of gold in their revenge plan. There's empowerment buried in there. So the actual revenge, indulging it would be the acting out of it, which I don't actually stand by. But the fleshing it out in order to get the gold from it, I think, is really valuable, and then it allows us to go to that next place. But I think it's really destructive when someone is in despair and rage to attempt to invalidate them, to quickly say, you got to forgive. That's just a projection. That's someone feeling uncomfortable with anger, frankly.
And I think that I think you make a really important point. And we actually had a conversation about forgiveness up in San Francisco that was fueled by some tequila, which was a great conversation. You had talked about the importance of honoring the space and the time that people need in order to be ready to forgive. And in the forgiveness challenge, we ask people to kind of think about the people they need to forgive, and some they're ready to forgive, and some they're not ready to forgive. But I wanted to come to something you talk about grief in this grudge, and the role of grief. And I think, and so do the Tutus talk about that in the book of Forgiving, about the importance of grief. And grieving is about, the loss of what might have been. It's the loss of what your dreams, your hopes, your love, the past that otherwise you could have had. And I just was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that role of grief in your life, and that as a part of the path towards forgiveness.
Yeah, I think sometimes it can be the challenge to moving toward full-blown surrender and connection and forgiveness, because as long as we hold on to the victim consciousness and the rage and the blamefulness, we don't have to feel grief. And the sensation somatically of grief in our bodies for a lot of us can be really uncomfortable. There's a few feelings. Somehow anger is a little more tolerable to some than full-blown grief. And totally. Sadness. So to the degree that we're comfortable with grieving, and I don't know how many of us really are, I'm not still, I resist it tooth and nail. But then once I can actually entertain that grief and allow it to move through my body, there's a real light on the other side. And that light is bedfellow with forgiveness to me, that light and that lightness that comes from forgiveness. And it's a deeply loving act, and when we're first responding or reacting, frankly, to the situation that requires forgiveness, we're not necessarily in that loving place. We may be horrified. We may be sort of catapulted into the awareness that separatism does exist, and that all these personality disorders that come from our traumas create behavior that is very separatist, and it's deeply existentially painful to entertain that. So we're not only grieving the loss of hopes and dreams in any microcosmic relationship that we're talking about, we're also grieving the fact that as on a human level that separatism even exists. And for those of us who are more empathic, one small interaction to me can denote the millions of interactions that are happening like this around the world, politically, between nations, within our own hearts, within our connections with spirit, from tribe to tribe. I mean, it's forgiveness really brings into question the whole idea of how we treat each other on a very larger macrocosmic scale. So the grief can be very intense to entertain, but I would encourage it in others, and I certainly encourage it in myself, to feel it fully, because the rewards and the sense of connection with spirit and other, there's nothing like that intimacy of connecting soul to soul with people. It's why we're here.
And you said, it's a very loving act, the forgiving and experience, going through that grieving process and coming to forgiveness. It's a very self-loving act as well. I mean, because you're basically letting go of that burden. And this grudge that you carry around, there's divine timing to all of it. Like sometimes even writing a song about it, like writing this grudge, I still in the chorus I'm declaring that I want to forgive, but that I'm not quite there yet. So there was even regret in the writing of that lyric around, I wish I were readier. For forgiveness, but I'm still a little victim consciousness, and I still feel offended, and I still feel, I still felt the separatism in my body, and a lot of times when we're feeling grief about one relationship, we're feeling grief about millions of relationships, like I just said. So it's a brave act to be willing to feel all the feelings that come along on the linear journey toward forgiveness, and some, like I said, some take longer than others. And maybe as you do the forgiveness challenge, some of that hesitation or limitation that you were experiencing in writing this grudge will lead to the next song. So
so I'll write part duh.
Awesome. Well, we're so excited to have you taking the forgiveness challenge with us, to be on that journey together. So grateful to be on the journey of exploration with you and your family, and want to thank you so much for this time together. It's been a real gift to me and to our participants.
It's such an honor to be part of this, Doug. Thank you for inviting me, and I just love you and I love your family so much, and I just see what you're doing, and thank you for pulling me to my next place, because there's a part of me that has tiptoed around the idea of forgiveness my whole life. And I've never really I've been known for perhaps mercy or empathy, but I can tell you that I was not known for forgiveness. So you inviting me into this larger conversation is a real honor for me, and I'm just really grateful to you. Thank you.